And I'd like to recognize the gentleman from Kansas, Mr. Estes.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I'm so glad we're having this hearing today on this very important topic. You know, the facts are that as representatives, we have a responsibility to ensure taxpayer dollars are used efficiently and effectively, and the evidence is apparent. There has been nearly unchecked unemployment fraud. Now, I want to be clear, in the early uncertain days of the pandemic, there were good reasons to help countless Americans who faced those unprecedented economic challenges through no fault of their own. But we're nearly 3 years past the first pandemic-related legislation, and my colleagues on the left have chosen to completely ignore the rampant fraud that has cost taxpayers an untold amount. Estimates in some points and some outlets have ranged up to as high as $300 to $400 billion. In addition to the money lost, there's evidence of gross incompetence, including from the Governor's Department of Labor in my home state of Kansas, that left many without assistance who desperately needed it. Despite unemployment being a function managed by the state, my office in Wichita received more than 1,000 calls from constituents who were negatively impacted by Kansas' unemployment system. I have many stories of people impacted. For more than a half a year, one constituent waited while her legitimate claim mysteriously ended up in the fraud department. Despite repeated calls and attempts to resolve the issue, nobody in the Kansas Department of Labor could help her. Others reached out to let us know that they themselves had been victims of fraud. Several received a notification in the fall of 2020 that someone had filed claims for unemployment under their name and received a 1099 in 2021, claiming that they owed taxes on the benefits someone else had received. Today, we still hear from Kansans who are victims of fraud or have yet to receive benefits they deserve. These are just a few of the cases, but they point to a real problem in Kansas and across the country. Taxpayers lost out to fraudsters who used the pandemic, massive amounts of federal funds, and weak state leadership to game the system. In May of 2021, Ways and Means Republicans held a roundtable on this subject, and I invited State Representative Sean Tarwater to testify. As the chair of the Kansas House of Commerce, Labor, and Economic Development Committee, he saw firsthand the issue with fraud and unemployment. In his testimony, he said, "We documented over 40 times the Kansas Department of Labor was notified, directed, and informed about massive concerns regarding unemployment benefit frauds." He also said that when the Kansas Department of Labor, when asked about the fraud, their response was they're not worried about the fraud because the big money, quote unquote, was in the federal funds, and it was mostly the federal programs that were being targeted, and that they would always add that they were not held responsible for those funds so that it was not a priority. Mr. Chair, I'd like to submit to the record 2 audits conducted by the Kansas Legislative Division of Post-Audit that indicated roughly $700 million in potentially fraudulent payments were made, with half coming from state funds and half coming from federal, or about $344 million.
Without objection.
Despite the evidence, there's not an incentive for states to recover these unemployment frauds, and hardworking Kansas taxpayers are left with the bill. Mr. Horowitz, what processes are in place for states to help recoup funds lost to UI fraud, both state and federal funding?
So I think one of the key parts of that is working closely with IGs, local state law enforcement, and their state's attorneys general to make sure there are processes by which the taxpayers can get the money back. That's one of the things we're trying to do, is work closely and have focused on with state auditors. In fact, we created the first ever state auditor in residence program. So we have 2 Tennessee state auditors working with the PRAC to help us, as well as the former California state auditor, so we can develop those relationships and work more closely with the states.
So how are you looking at or expecting states to recover funds that may have been a result of international crime? And what state or federal jurisdiction is there, and what's been currently done on that front?
So the SWAs, the state workforce agencies, they're not the law enforcement arm of this, of course. So the key is working with local law enforcement, federal law enforcement. We're working with the Secret Service, FBI, other federal law enforcement agencies, and trying to develop those partnerships, because that is the key to the success of moving forward. There has to be the interest not only in making sure the money gets out, which is obviously important, to the right people, but then making sure when it doesn't get to the right people that there's the recovery.
Right. Well, thank you. And I want to thank all of our witnesses for the work that you're doing on behalf of the American taxpayers and helping make sure that we get money in the right hands and that taxpayers are protected. I yield back.
I want to thank the representative, and now I'll recognize the